circumstances, companies in the UK are paying 21% tax on their profits, but because Google routes its UK sales via Ireland and in some cases via the Caribbean, it pays much less each year than this £130 million tax deal, which covers a decade of accounts, by the way. And the increasing clamour about whether Google has got off lightly or not formed the centrepiece of today's Prime Minister's questions. Labour's Jeremy Corbyn defending his party's record and questioning why there appeared to be one rule for big multinationals like Google and another for small businesses and the self-employed.
Mr. Speaker, it was under a Labour government that the inquiries were begun into Google, and in addition, as a percentage of GDP, corporation tax receipts are lower under this government than they were under previous governments. I've got a question here, Mr. Speaker, from a gentleman called Jeff. Now, you might well laugh, but Jeff actually speaks for millions of people when he says to me, "Can you ask the Prime Minister if, as a working man of over 30 years, whether there is a scheme which I can join that pays the same rate of tax as Google and other large corporations?" What does the Prime Minister say to Jeff?
Well, what I say to Jeff is that his taxes are coming down under this government and Google's taxes are going up under this government. Let me say to the right honourable gentleman, something he just said in his last question was factually inaccurate. He said corporation tax receipts have gone down. They've actually gone up by 20% under this government because we've got a strong economy with businesses making money, employing people, investing in our country and paying taxes into the exchequer. And let me say to him, if, like me, he's genuinely angry about what happened to Google under Labour, can I tell him a few people he could call? Maybe he should start by calling Tony Blair. You can get him at JP Morgan. Call Gordon Brown. Apparently you can get him at a Californian bond dealer called PIMCO. He could call Alistair Darling. I think he's at Morgan Stanley, but it's hard to keep up. Those are the people to blame for Google not paying their taxes. We're the ones who got them to pay.
So, a flavour of the exchanges there on the Google tax controversy in Prime Minister's questions today. Let's discuss this now with two guests. We have the Conservative MP Mark Garnier, who sits on the Treasury Select Committee. Thanks for joining us, Mr Garnier. And we're also joined by Sir Vince Cable, the former Lib Dem Business Secretary, and, of course, who served in the same government as George Osborne during the coalition years. Sir Vince, thanks for joining us as well. So the same question to both of you. And, Vince, if I can start with you, is this a cosy deal with Google or not?
Well, I don't know if it's cosy, but it's a very poor deal. I mean, we need to remember that, I think 18 months, 2 years ago in the coalition, George Osborne went out of his way to say that the government was going to adopt a much tougher approach to the big internet platforms and because of their tax problems, and we had this special tax introduced. But this is a very, very weak deal on almost any measure. And we can't really challenge whether it's a good deal in practice because they won't disclose the information. But the substance of the matter is this, that under the so-called base shifting agreements that have been reached in OECD, companies should be taxed for corporate tax purposes on where the activity is and where the assets are, where the business is transacted. And as you correctly pointed out a few minutes ago, in this $4 billion Google operation in the UK, I mean, that isn't just issuing sales invoices. There are lots of very highly paid people here doing serious work, drawing up contracts. And that is the base on which the tax should be charged. So Google have got off very, very lightly. Chancellor, I think, has made a complete fool of himself by announcing this as a success. His own colleagues, even Rupert Murdoch, saying this is a very, very bad deal, and undermining the efforts we're making in Europe, the French, the Italians, the European Commission, trying to get much tougher with companies like Google. And they're going out unilaterally with this very weak deal undermines all these efforts.
Mr Garnier, do you have concerns about it?
Well, it's very difficult to understand exactly what's going on because, of course, quite rightly, the deal that's been arrived at is one that is done in complete secrecy between HMRC and Google. And of course, that is a privilege and a right that is given to every single person within this country. And so in order to be able to get to the actual details of this deal, and therefore to understand it properly, would be to go back on that fundamental right that everybody enjoys. But look, I think it is worth bearing in mind that we are not talking about current tax laws. We're talking about tax laws between 2005 and 2011. And these are tax laws which HMRC have spent 6 years investigating in the context of Google's profits and Google's tax paid. And this is what they've come up with. So the argument seems to be very peculiar for Labour to keep banging on about, because this is an argument about the tax laws that they had introduced at the time and how the Labour government had failed to meet the expectations of the British taxpayer.
Sir Vince, I'll come to you in a second, but just to pick up on that then, Mr Garnier, you know, if people start getting the sense that this is a 3% tax rate for Google, or indeed any other big multinational, that is when the credibility and trust in this system starts to be eroded, isn't it?
I completely agree with you, but I don't know how they've come to that 3% level. What people have done is they've looked at the published accounts of Google and they've basically made an assumption, given X revenues against Y expenses in the UK equals Z profits. Therefore, this represents 3% of that. But that's not necessarily how it works, because there is other elements which come into this, which is the intellectual property. So there's a value to that. And of course, the intellectual property is based in America. So there are various other things. Look, I don't disagree that it seems very, very unfair, but it's a very spurious argument because, as I say, we have some very well-intentioned and probably very intelligent people who are coming up with this 3% effective rate, basically which they've worked out recently, compared with HMRC, who we have to trust to a certain extent, who spent 6 years looking at this with a huge amount of resources, with the ability to go forensically into Google's accounts and come up with what they believe is the best deal they can possibly get for the British taxpayer. Now, I completely accept that it looks fishy, if you like, but sometimes we do have to accept that HMRC have got it right.
If it does look fishy, Sir Vince, again, what are your thoughts on the kind of level of trust that, you know, ordinary taxpayers, if I can use that phrase, should have in this system?
Well, I wouldn't use words like fishy. It sort of implies there's some kind of conspiracy. I think actually the government's just being very, very naive. It's not fishy. I think they've just accepted at face value analysis which is almost certainly very, very generous to the company. And they didn't, George Osborne didn't need to go out in Davos and claim that this was a great success. I think that the point I would take up with Mr Garnier is this whole issue about confidentiality. Of course, an individual's tax affairs should remain very private, and that's absolutely right. But we're here talking about corporate entities. We're not talking about individuals. There is a move, an internationally agreed move at the moment, to move to country-by-country accounting. I think there's something going to be announced today about that, and that will make the whole system much more transparent. But it is absolutely hopeless for the government, on the one hand, to say that this is a very good deal, and then to say, well, it's all private, and therefore we can't tell you how we got to the numbers. I mean, it's not a sustainable and defensible position at all.
And on that very important transparency point, Mr Garnier, that again is where people have difficulty in trusting what's going on, because, you know, as Sir Vince says, if they don't have a clear picture of precisely how this sum was arrived at, you know, they're not going to trust it, surely.
I do agree with that. I mean, there are a number of requirements that any corporation has, which is they have to file accounts at Companies House. Google is a listed company, so it has publication requirements for its consolidated accounts. So the accounts are all freely available. But of course, HMRC is what's known as a non-ministerial department. And that means that ministers cannot, under any circumstances, get involved in the day-to-day, if you like, casework of HMRC for actually very, very sensible reasons. I mean, it would be truly appalling if, for example, George Osborne or any chancellor decided that they wanted to have a go at the leader of the opposition and launch, if you like, a bogus tax investigation just as you're coming up to a general election, or indeed equally so if a hypothetical chancellor decided they wanted to favour a business in their constituency by reducing their tax rate. And that's why HMRC is a non-ministerial department, in order to have that arm's length relationship. And that's why, ultimately, whilst we're talking about all of this, we're talking about hypothetical numbers. We're not talking about numbers that we can absolutely trust. with these estimations of a 3% tax rate.
A final point to both of you, because of course there's a broader theme in terms of other companies. This question is not coming up for the first time. Just noting, for example, if you take Amazon, the big online retailer, the UK arm of Amazon paying 11.9 million in tax in 2014. Their British shoppers were 5.3 billion. Again, Sir Vince, when people look at the broad figures, not looking into the detail, when they look at those broad figures, they think that something's slightly wrong.
Well, they will, but I think where we have common ground on this is that we do need to be objective and look at evidence rather than just rely on instinct. And what this government is doing, and what I'm afraid the Labour government did in the past, is to isolate Britain from a concerted approach to dealing with the problem. The European Commission at the moment is investigating Amazon and Google and Facebook and the others, partly on anti-competitive behaviour, partly on large-scale tax avoidance. And we should be supporting that. And we should be supporting efforts to get a common tax base so that issues like royalty payments and depreciation can be treated on the same basis across countries. But by Britain going out on its own, trying to be a so-called competitive tax haven, rather than working cooperatively with other countries, we're just letting these companies run rings around government, and that is not right.
Mr Garnier, final word. If there was more cooperation, we'd have more of a chance of maybe getting a better deal on these things.
Sir Vince highlights actually quite an interesting conundrum with this, which is when you look at the interests of each individual country. One of the interesting things about the Google tax, they-called Google tax, is that whilst, of course, we're all trying to get together to come to an agreement on how to resolve this, actually this tax that's been diverted away from the UK, if this is the case, actually ends up being paid in the US. And it's a similar case that UK with a very low tax rate compared with the G20 has an advantage. If we have multinational companies based in the UK that are generating revenues across the world, the more of that revenue that they can bring back to the UK, the better it is, of course, for British taxpayers. Now, I think most fair-minded people would say, well, look, even if that does benefit us, it's right that if you're carrying on a business activity in India, for example, you should pay your taxes in India because that's where you're deriving economic activity. But Sir Vince is right. We do need to do this on a multi-country basis in order to get agreement on this. But nonetheless, I would defend this government's right to be able to set our own tax rates, because we have to determine what is the best tax rate for our type of business activity and our type of economy.
OK, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, both of you, Mark Garnier and Sir Vince Cable.